germ theory or the terrain theory. Now, this is part one. There will be part two, which I will be presenting in July. And in part two, we're going to look into more details into how to boost the immune system. And so we will explore some of the many ways that have been promoted, such as lifestyle factors, nutrition, herbal medicine, and of course, aromatherapy, and what role they can play to support the immune system. So please mark this down in your diary. It will be Wednesday, the 20th of July, same time, same place, same channel. Now, by the way, just in case, if you're on Facebook, you'll see that I wasn't feeling the best, not joking, and Lucy was going to do the presentation for me. That's our little beagle, so check out the photo on Facebook. Okay, now, this is probably why, and some of you might be upset that I didn't say more, but this is probably why I did not, I wasn't very vocal during the COVID pandemic. When I did a Google search for boosting immunity, 17 million results. So you can imagine there was a plethora of information available, some of it very good and some of it a little bit so-so. Now, it's very interesting that nutritional supplements and food featured very high in the search. Now, there was a lot of criticism as well of the way in which boosting immunity was promoted. And this is what I want to address and explore in tonight's presentation. And what was some of the more controversial, and I don't like saying that it's controversial because it really isn't controversial. Now, I want to make it very clear that tonight's presentation is not about should you get immunized or not, vaccinated or not vaccinated. It's not about pro-vax or anti-vax. It's more about presenting some of the facts and some of the information that was responsible for stirring both parties, those that supported vaccination and those that didn't support vaccination. And hopefully you can make your own decision on what is the best thing to do moving forward. Now, in the webinar, we're going to, of course, examine what the germ theory is, what the terrain theory is. We're going to look at how this all started, and it seems to have started between a feud between two very prominent scientists and researchers in the 19th century in France, Pasteur and Bechamp. Now, both of them are highly regarded and very, very important people, but Pasteur seems to get all the credit for everything. Now, we'll find out why. And perhaps the feud isn't so much between these two men of science, isn't between the terrain and germ theory as much as it is who got all the credit. Now, we will look at some of the interesting concepts that Bechamp put together, pleomorphism and the microzyma, and we will explore what does pleomorphism mean and what are microzyma and do they actually exist. In my own research, there were some things that I did not know when I started preparing for this presentation. Of course, with my background in naturopathy, I was fairly, I was on top of understanding the terrain theory and the germ theory, but there were some things that really I did not understand. And as a result of my research, I now have so much more respect for somebody like Bechamp. Now, of course, we will look briefly also at the role of the microbiota and immunity, and we'll finish the presentation on understanding the relationship between the essential oils and the microbiota. And this will be a nice lead on into part two of the webinar when we look at more specific approaches to supporting the immune system. Now, in the chapter on immunity, I start off by quoting Simon Mills, who is a very, very well accomplished herbalist from the UK, written many books and co-authored books with our very own Australian Kerry Bone, two very prominent herbalists. And here, Simon Mills starts off, and I want to read this. There is an ecological view of bacteria, viruses, and other disease-causing organisms that is rarely exposed. But Mills then goes on to say, in any balanced ecosystem, all living things have to find a niche that fits in with the whole. Every creature is part of the food cycle. Every excretion, every demise creates a source of nutrients for some other organism. Every act of predation creates an opportunity for more prey to fill the gap. Thus, all bacteria, fungi, virus, every form of mosquito, fly, or other pest must have their positive role in the balance of life. An attitude that says that any of these life forms is always evil, always to be attacked, is unimaginative and counterproductive as any jingoistic nationalism. Now, I think we've seen a lot of jingoistic nationalism when it comes to the terrain theory and the germ theory in the last couple of years. But that makes it very clear that Simon Mills understands and is promoting the terrain theory. So if we've studied naturopathy, herbal medicine, Chinese medicine, all these premises are very much based around the terrain theory. Of course, furthermore, for example, I think this is a book that was published in 2012 by Dr. August, End of Illness. Even this doctor who has done a lot of research in proteomics, sequencing proteins and so on, he suggests that we've had a hard time moving past this germ theory, which has dominated, in many ways, has dominated and many ways defined medicine in the 20th century. He goes on to say, according to this theory, if you can figure out what the species of germ is that has infected you, then your problem is solved, because you can then treat the disease. Now, doctors will perform a laboratory test to determine what the infectious agent is, then apply the treatment for that specific agent, obviously, commonly antibiotics. The treatment only cares about the invading organism. It does not care to define or understand the host, or even where the infection was happening in the host. And this is why it ends up being that the same drug is used on every patient for a particular infection. So this is very much a concept which, once again, in holistic medicine, we are very familiar with. And you say, well, Sal, why am I repeating this? Because if you are watching this, perhaps you already understand this, but this is helping to build the picture, to help build the story, okay? Now, there's no doubt that, as I said, that the COVID pandemic created a very high level of tension, divisiveness, and polarization. And I feel that in a very short period, much of the progress that had been made by complementary and alternative medicine within that more integrated medical framework has been lost. And what do I mean by that? There seemed to have been, and I've got this feeling from everything that I was observing happening and all the discussions and so on, that there was this prevailing attitude that if you denied the germ theory, then you were supporting anti-vaccination. If you were supporting the germ theory, then you must, as a consequence, also be anti-natural medicine. And this is very disappointing. So we saw this very stark polarization within these two, whereas until this period, I could really see, and look, I might be wrong, in some areas, in some parts of the world, complementary therapists probably worked very closely with mainstream medicine. And I've seen, and we've seen that. But this is what I've observed. Now, some have even argued that the germ, those who deny the germ theory have been responsible for all the anti-vaccination movement. But what concerns me is that they are often very critical of all forms of natural therapies. Now, by the way, you will have access to a very comprehensive blog that I have written. So please take the time to read that. In that blog, you'll see all the references that I've listed here. You might want to check some of these out. They're very, very, very interesting. You know, and it's just annoying on both sides of the paradigm. Somebody said the deep dive into stupid. So if you support complementary therapies, you're stupid. Meet the growing group that rejects the germ theory. So this is what I actually want to explore further as we go along. Now, of course, what the pandemic raised was some very interesting historical rivalry that existed between Béchamp and Pasteur. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time understanding who these two men were. Two men that, by the way, I probably have a lot of admiration and respect because they were very much pioneers in their field in the 19th century. This was the dawn of what you would call a more investigative approach to science. And it was the dawn of understanding that microbes, now I don't want to get in trouble here, but microbes were cause of many disease. Now, as a result, Louis Pasteur is often referred to as the father of the germ theory. So not only did Pasteur help to discover that microbes cause infectious disease, but he actually laid down the groundwork for modern vaccinations. And as a result, he's often referred to also as the father of microbiology. These are terms that are used. I didn't make these up, okay? So I find it a little bit patronizing, the father of the germ theory and so on. But these are the terms that are often used within historical texts. Now, it's very, very interesting that what Pasteur back then understood, especially, he did actually lay some groundwork for understanding vaccinations, but his understanding of the immune system was actually wrong. So his approach to understanding how a vaccination might work was not like it is today. Now, this is what has been written about Pasteur. He is acknowledged as one of the most prestigious scientists who has made all these wonderful contributions and major improvements in the war against pathogens. You've got to remember that this was the dawn of appreciation of the microbe. For the first time, we understood what the microbe was. He also developed processes such as pasteurization, which led to the sterilization of wines. By establishing this germ theory of infectious diseases, it allowed people like Joseph Lister to develop antiseptics to use within surgery. And of course, he's also referred to as the father of immunology. However, as I previously said, a lot of what he had believed about how the immune system worked was not correct. But he did lay down the foundations for others to follow and develop what became known as the field of immunology. Now, on the other hand, Antonio Béchamp suggested that microbes are not the cause of infection unless the condition within the body, encouraged their growth. Very important differentiation. So this is very, very interesting. Now, Béchamp actually probably had a few more certificates and diplomas and degrees than Pasteur. Pasteur predominantly was a chemist. Now, I look at this and I often think, it's interesting to look at the comparison that is made, for example, between people like Tesla and Edison, for example, and they're probably very similar comparisons that one can make. Béchamp studied pharmacology. He actually taught in various universities. He actually succeeded Pasteur as a professor of chemistry at one of the universities, because by this time Pasteur had his own laboratories. And in 1856, he was appointed the professor of medical chemistry and pharmacology in the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Montpellier, where he worked for more than 20 years. Now, I personally believe, from what I've read, that the rivalry was not so much that between the germ theory or the terrain theory. The rivalry started because these two such brilliant people were probably researching at the same time, what caused the causes of fermentation, for example, and they both had identified the microbes. Now, Pasteur is believed published the paper first, but Béchamp says he also had published the paper, but it didn't get the recognition from the Academy of Sciences. So Pasteur got all the credit. Now, when you get all the credit, you get all the funding to do the extra research. So perhaps some of the real rivalry started there because Bechamp was working on the same research project as Pasteur. So they were working independently. And as a result, there were all these accusations made of plagiarism made from both parties. So that is where the true feud probably started. Now, Béchamp, but I want to now go back to Béchamp's terrain theory. Béchamp says that the germs are always present in the environment and they don't necessarily cause the disease. The disease is more associated with the physiology of the host, of the person, and not the germs per se, which is in very stark contrast to the modern Western medical approach, which is changing. And by the end of this presentation, you'll understand it's changing, which implies by killing the germ, we can cure the disease. Now, one author, and this is where I get upset, because Béchamp was he was very brilliant in his work, but to refer to him as the 19th century crank who tried to tell us about the microbiome. We'll talk more about this paper because this is very interesting, but here, the focus of this is Pontin actually says that Béchamp was responsible for invoking all the anti-vaxxers and also what he referred to as the disciples of alternative medicine who believe that food is medicine. Well, we'll probably learn later that it will support the terrain. So a very, very interesting criticism here of Béchamp. But Pontin then will go on to say that perhaps what Béchamp's was all about was understanding the microbiome. And we now know, so there's no more germ theory or terrain theory. Let's get straight to the point, because we know about the microbiome and we know that if there is dysbiosis, if there is imbalance in all the microorganisms that make the microbiome, then you will get illness. This is what we now know. This is what scientists know now. This is what doctors now know. So we should really be putting to bed this argument between the terrain theory and the germ theory. Both have their very important place to play. So who was right? I've already told you who was right. Now, but this is what's interesting. And you see, Béchamp never got credit for anything. If anything, he was criticized for some of the later research work that he published, because it was probably not very well understood and they didn't have the technology, they didn't have the tools to see or understand what these microzyma are. And I'll explain this very soon. Now, if, for example, when Pasteur died, it became like a very, very important. When Pasteur died, it was a very important event within France, and it became a national holiday, perhaps because he was hailed as like one of the heroes of science at the time. However, when Béchamp passed away in 1908, it was an event that was largely ignored in France. However, there was a Dr. Montague Levison from Baltimore who persuaded a writer and a sympathizer, Ethel Douglas Hume, to collate all these notes that he had collected and that became published as a book in 1923. And the title of this book was Bechamp or Pasteur, a lost chapter in the history of biology. Now, some of these books, they might be hard to get, but I know that you can still get digital versions of them. Very interesting to look at, very interesting to read. The book, of course, was very highly critical of Pasteur's work and accuses Pasteur of plagiarism and fabrication. If it was not for this book, it is likely that, and I doubt that the terrain theory would have disappeared, but the work that Béchamp did would not be remembered today. So I think we have Ethel Hume to thank for us remembering and acknowledging the work of Béchamp. I did find a very interesting description of Pasteur's character in the book. And when you read this, of course, it's going to provoke some distrust about Pasteur and the germ theory. The author suggests that Pasteur approached science from a purely commercial point of view, and to say that it was like focusing more on what benefit can I get from it. Whereas Béchamp had a more artistic outlook. He was more interested in understanding the truth and knowledge, and it was independent of profit. And he longed to penetrate what she refers to as the unexplored realms of nature's secret. So he wanted to follow in the footsteps of truth. So this is very, very supportive of the work of Béchamp and very critical of the work of Pasteur. Now, it's very interesting. I found this was published in 2022. So, and it was Louis Pasteur, Between the Myth and the Reality. So this is a very recent publication, and it was published to celebrate Pasteur's work. It's, I think, 200-year anniversary. And it's very interesting. While this paper speaks very highly of Pasteur, it also went into a character analysis of Pasteur, describing him as arrogant, contemptuous, dogmatic, individualistic, authoritarian, careerist, greedy, and ruthless to his opponents. So he probably wouldn't have liked Béchamp being critical and suggesting that Pasteur was a plagiarist and had copied his work. Okay, so Pasteur became very successful in his lifetime with his work that he did, but all the credit went to him, and so he was going to be very defensive of what he had achieved. And as a result, sadly, Béchamp never got the credit that he should have. Now, it's not surprising that Pasteur became the scorn of many others, especially those supporting the terrain theory and the anti-vaccination movement as a result. And another 1942 publication, The Dream and Lie of Louis Pasteur, written by R.B. Pearson, attacks the reputation of Pasteur. It's very interesting that this book was supported and promoted by the Anti-Vaccination League of London. And the credit is mentioned. So once again, some of these books you won't be able to get hard copies of, but they are available online. Now, it is often written that Pasteur on his deathbed said, my French is terrible, I only did high school French. So I'm going to go straight to the English version. Béchamp was right. The microbe is nothing. The terrain is everything. I saw this mentioned in several papers and publications. It is very unlikely to be incorrect, that quote. It is more than likely, and this is where I'm going to introduce a third person to this feud. It is more likely to have been Bernard was right. The microbe is nothing. The terrain is everything. Now, who is Bernard? Now, he's somebody else that is very, very important, who was working at the same time as Pasteur and Béchamp in the fields of microbiology and medicine. Now, Claude Bernard, if there is anything that he is often accredited to, he is accredited as the founder of modern medicine and the founder of modern experimental physiology. And Bernard also laid the groundwork, the foundations for what became the term was coined homeostasis, which in other words is referring to the terrain. So if anything, Claude Bernard had more involvement in establishing this notion and this concept of the terrain, which is very important in healing and Western medicine today. Now, so Bernard and Béchamp shared this similar concept of the terrain, and yet Claude Bernard is rarely mentioned in the debate between the terrain or germ theory. I found one or two papers that acknowledge the work of Claude Bernard. And as I say, the terrain theory is more aligned with the milieu intérieur that Bernard described rather than the work of Béchamp. Now, Béchamp also came up with a couple of other interesting ideas, but these ideas that he came up with were through his observations. He came up with this notion of pleomorphism and microzyma. And this is where for a while, and this is where he probably started to be ridiculed by the Academy of Science and all the scientists of the time. Here, Pasteur had come up with this approach to say the microbe is the cause of disease. By eradicating the microbe, look what's happening. And there's no doubt that it would have worked effectively. So when Béchamp postulated that bacteria arose from these structures called microzyma, which he referred to as a type of enzyme, and that the microzyma are present in the tissues and their effects, or what effect that they have, depends on the cellular terrain. Now, this led to Béchamp's work on pleomorphism that led him to believe that the microorganisms arise from the microzyma and that they are able to spontaneously transform into other microorganisms. This is exactly what Béchamp said. Now, this is like one life form changing into another life form, and it depends on the terrain. So for a lot of people, this would have been very difficult to accept and to understand. He explains this very clearly in The Blood and Its Third Element. This is out of print, but you can find it online. And this book outlines his microzomia theory, which the translator of this book says in the preface, it has far-reaching relevance to the fields of immunology, bacteriology, and cellular biology. Now, the problem was that it was acknowledged that Béchamp said that these microzoma were too difficult to be seen, even by the microscopes of the time. So it's very interesting how he actually was able to come to the conclusion of their existence. Now, I'd always thought this, and this is where I had a hard time grappling with it. I said, look, is there this conspiracy theory that all the researchers, all the scientists and academics are denying and ignoring that they've, up till now, nobody has been able to identify these microzoma? So obviously, Béchamp was wrong. However, as we'll find out, maybe he wasn't wrong. Now, Young, who has written this article, a very interesting article, very well written, who had their finger on the magic of life, and Antonio Béchamp or Louis Pasteur. Now, Young is a supporter of the terrain theory, and he's obviously disappointed that many of Béchamp's theories have not been given fair examination in mainstream science. I dispute that. I actually think now Béchamp's theories have been given a really good examination into mainstream science. And I think mainstream science is now starting to give some credit. So I can imagine in the next decade or two, we're going to see a lot of Béchamp's work rewritten back into the history books. Because as Young says, and this is true, Béchamp's extraordinary achievements have been written out of history books, textbooks, and encyclopedia. And it's because he supported this notion, because he had this notion of microzomia and the fact that they can just transform, pleomorphism, that they can transform into another life form. So that was very, very difficult for people to embrace and to understand this concept. Now, Bechamp also claimed that these microzomia are the very foundation building blocks of cellular life, even at a genetic level, and they are the foundation of all biological organization. Very, very interesting notion. Bechamp said that microzoma routinely become forms, normally what we call bacteria, and then these bacteria can revert or devolve back into a microzomia state. Now, at death, the microzoma becomes bacteria, eventually reducing the cells of the higher organism to dust and then reverting back to microsomes. How very interesting that is. Now, Bechamp also said the microzoma are too small to differentiate with the microscope, even in today's equipment. And this is what is really, I think this guy is a genius, because we'll talk about these microzoma more. He used a polarimeter, and he was using the polarimeter, he was able to draw all these conclusions about microzoma. Now, this is, I won't say it's a crude instrument. We use it today analyzing essential oils, especially if essential oils have been adulterated. It's to do with measuring the way light is refracted. I won't go into the technicalities of this, but he does talk about it in more detail in some of the books that we have been speaking about. Now, as I say here, it's not surprising that Pasteur and the established science of the time refused to accept this microzomia theory. It sounded too far-fetched. However, I'm suggesting that Bechamp was simply somebody way ahead of his time. Why is that? Now, I became interested, and this is where I started to do a lot of research. And some of you may be familiar with, for example, Alan Cantwell. He talks about the cancer microbe. Now, I was hoping to find some interesting information about these very small, minute microbes that are so difficult to see. And his work is now really being closely examined. And you'll see some publications have come out that they refer to nanobacteria. Now, by the way, in this particular book, which I think was published in 1990, there's a whole chapter dedicated to microzomia. And even in 1990, the research wasn't there to understand these nanobacteria, what these nanobacteria are. And I thought, oh my God, these microzomia are nanobacteria. And Bechamp identified these way back in the 19th century. How amazing. By the way, and I'm just making this comment here, this book, I found it a very interesting read. Cantwell, in this book, the chapter on microzomia, it's quite disappointing because all he's doing is repeating what Bechamp had described, and he's not providing any new evidence about the existence of these microzomia. Now, but as I started thinking, oh, maybe these microzomia are what we now refer to as nanobacteria. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because for a while, this was like these nanobacteria were going to revolutionize and became quite controversial in the field of microbiology. They displayed these lifelike and pleomorphic characteristics. That means they could be observed. And this is now what researchers were doing. They were noticing that they were changing shape and changing form, and they possessed these biometric properties, lifelike properties. So that's why they were believed to be these incredibly small bacteria, because they were often found highly active in states of disease, states of disharmony, states of body states of inflammation. So wherever the terrain was out of balance. So it was naturally assumed that these nanobacteria, or I will start using the word nanoparticles, are they responsible for this state of disharmony, for the inflammation that exists within the body tissue? Now, it's very interesting. I was watching a documentary on TV recently, and some of the research, and this was about Alzheimer's disease, and they're talking about now amyloid and saying the amyloid in the brain, and they're saying higher levels of amyloid are present in the brain, and they make this association with Alzheimer's. Now, the approach, the pharmaceutical approach is, okay, let's develop drugs that will reduce this amyloid in the brain. But is amyloid in the brain just the same way as these nanobacteria in the tissue that is that damaged or not well? Is it simply a feature or a hallmark of the condition, or is it actually responsible for the pathology? See, we don't really know that. Now, the point is, and I won't go into all the detail, but when you read my blog, you'll get to, I'll delve into it a lot deeper. It proves that these researchers have now proven that these nanobacteria that display this lifelike and pleomorphic characteristics are really just mineral organic nanoparticles possessing these lifelike qualities. I was a little bit disappointed when I read that. I thought, oh my God, we've discovered this new life form bacteria that we had not been able to identify in the past. Unfortunately, it appears that these nanobacteria are really formed within the body. They're a combination of calcium carbonates, phosphates, and when there is an imbalance of ions, these little particles, these little nanoparticles are formed. So what we now describe them as nanoparticles. Now, these nanoparticles are responsible. They seem to be implicated. First of all, they cause they cause immune response. So that's why they thought, oh my God, so we had macrophages who were clearing these nanoparticles. So they activate immune response. Of course, that leads to inflammation. They are also found where there is calcification in the body, kidney stone formation, calcification in the bloodstream, bone mineralization. And of course, they lead to immune, they have a great impact on the immune response. So they do have a real physiological involvement, but we don't know if they are the cause, and should the treatments be developed to reduce these nanoparticles in the body, or are they simply a feature of the inflammation? We don't know yet. So, but what my point is that what Béchamp thought was microzyma, we now know he was observing these nanobacteria. This is what researchers call them for a while, which are really now these lifeless nanoparticles. But these nanoparticles do behave in a life that they exhibit all the characteristics when we observe them as having lifelike features. How interesting. So Béchamp was definitely a man ahead of his time, because he noted that they existed. And he said that they were the cause of the disharmony. And so I just think that is absolutely incredible. This is a very interesting paper, which I'll reference in the blog if you want to know more about these nanoparticles and their possible implication within health and disease. So there's still a lot of work going on, and it's a very exciting area. Now, I do want to move on, and I do want to talk a little bit now on presenting different sides of the story, and this now is leading to a discussion where we need to be more inclusive in our approach of the germ theory and the terrain theory. Now, for example, there have been, not everybody that got COVID had symptoms. So there was a lot of what we refer to as asymptomatic infections. Now, asymptomatic infections have been used as evidence for the terrain theory. And what they did find, however, one paper, very interesting paper that was published in 2021 said that asymptomatic infections was significantly lower in elderly compared to children. And of course, we know that as we age, the immune system becomes weaker now compared to children. Now, the other thing that the researchers also found was that those with comorbidities had significantly lower asymptomatic infections. So the higher the risk of illness and disease, whether it was cardiovascular disease, whether it was some other respiratory diseases, inflammatory disease, it was less likely that you would experience asymptomatic infections. And of course, what this meant was this paper was simply going towards a policy about saying that those who probably are more asymptomatic, and this is where we will have an ongoing debate about this for a long time, is whether the social isolation policies, whether they were effective or not. Now, I can understand in some cases, yes, where especially around elderly. So practicing social distancing practices would probably be very important, even for elderly that are vaccinated, as we are seeing now. So, but this led to that policy around social distancing. But it is interesting to note, so of course, it's a good argument to support the terrain theory. Well, the healthier the body, the less likely you are going to present with symptoms associated with the viral infection. Now, as a result, of course, and this is just referring to a particular blog, so there has, of course, always been this mistrust of the pharmaceutical industry and its role, and perhaps in the role that it's propagated and perpetuated the notion of the germ theory. Now, Monteith, like many bloggers, has promoted the germ theory, and he's assuming this is wrong too. Assumes that those who support the germ theory believe that all microbes are bad and must be eradicated. That's simply not true. It's nonsense to suggest that we can prevent illness by killing all the microbes. And it certainly makes sense to improve our immunity and to increase the resistance to those pathogens by healthy lifestyle, diet, and so on. Now, of course, at the same time, we do need to acknowledge that pathogens can be life-threatening and that vaccinations have played a very important role in saving many lives. So what can we learn from the debate between Pasteur and Béchamp, or the terrain theory and the germ theory? Now, this is a paper that was published in 2015, and it's referring to, and in particular, this paper is very, very interesting because it's looking at eradicating tuberculosis and the challenges, the global emergency around tuberculosis. Now, this paper starts off, and I'm sure it says that tuberculosis remains a global emergency, causing an estimated 1.5 million deaths annually. The major focus of tuberculosis treatment has been on the antibiotic development towards the tuberculosis bacterium. Now, in the paper, they say, of course, that this treatment has very poor outcomes because there are many of the tuberculosis bacterium strains are now drug resistant. So, as a result, even the pharmaceutical companies are going, oh, there must be better ways of approaching and managing tuberculosis. So The terminology now being used within the scientific community is host-directed therapies. And guess what host-directed therapies refers to? Therapies that will support the terrain, of course. And I, in one sense, am very cautious about the role of antibiotics that they have been playing, because we have seen a resistance built up through many of the microorganisms that antibiotics once were very successful at dealing with. So in this same paper, which is titled Host-Directed Therapies for Tackling Multi-Drug Resistance to Tuberculosis, and it goes on to say, learning from the Pasteur-Béchamp debates. So it's really good to see that researchers are now acknowledging the merits of both, and perhaps more leaning towards Béchamp. Now, as I said, the traditional treatment is now poor, and this is leading to an increase in the mortality from tuberculosis. Now, factors that are more focused more towards supporting the host means looking at factors that cause the immune system, the immune function, to be weak. Stress, poor living conditions, socioeconomic factors, micronutrient deficiencies. So all of a sudden I say, well, hold on. Researchers are now focusing on this. So when I read a blog that says those that suggest that food cannot boost or support the immune system, they're totally out of touch with the reality of what is happening at the ground level. Malnutrition, excess host inflammatory response to infection, alcohol and substance abuse, comorbidities, all these factors, and non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, chronic obstruction of the airways. These all are important features that, if they can be addressed, will lead to better outcome in the management of tuberculosis. And this is what these researchers are identifying. Now, another very interesting paper that also a paper written within the last 10 years is talking about while Pasteur's germ theory of disease was very successful in the development of antibiotics to fight disease, but now there's a change in the approach for dealing with these diseases, and the focus is focused on developing a healthy terrain through lifestyle practices rather than the elimination of pathogens. And so these changes now, we're starting to see this approach of approaching the terrain more in heart disease and diabetes, as well as areas of oncology, where there is a shift away from chemotherapy and radiation therapy and surgery to now exploring the role of immunotherapies, which optimizes the internal terrain and optimizes the immune system to fight the cancer. Now, so we've seen a shift already within what is happening within research. And which I want to make a challenging statement. I believe that immunization simply is one of many ways in which we can optimize the internal terrain to activate our immune system to fight dangerous pathogens. Now, I could do, and I would love to do later, another webinar where we kind of explore vaccinations, but that's not my field of strength, and and I really feel that is a personal choice. But I do definitely, if we understand how the immune system works, the principles of vaccination is that it actually helps to optimize the internal terrain by activating the immune system. So as I'm suggesting, let's put this to bed, this debate between the germ theory and the terrain theory. Those last, I've just shown how researchers are already doing that. But at the same time that we put that to bed, we should put to bed the criticism about complementary and alternative medicine. We should start to focus on the research that is now being done to show how complementary and alternative medicine is probably at the forefront of supporting the terrain. Now, this is very interesting. This gets now very interesting because some people believe that perhaps what Béchamp was all about, he was definitely wrong about the microzyma, but perhaps in which he was trying to support and in terms of the terrain, maybe he was onto describing what we now know of as the microbiota. Now, as we know, that microbiome science has now revolutionized the way we think about microbes and how we think about health, and that their involvement is very complex and probably related to almost every single disease that we can think of. The term that is used when the terrain or the microbiome is out of balance, imbalanced, is dysbiosis. Now, it's interesting that Bechamp suggested that cancers are caused by bacteria, as did a few other more contemporary doctors and researchers. Now, we now know that dysbiosis can lead to an increase in cancer activity as well. So perhaps the strategy is to rebalance the microbiome to see an improvement in health. Now, this as a result has led to shifted from this mentality of the germ theory of disease to a more encompassing microbial theory of health. I really like this term because it's saying that the microbes play a very important role in supporting health. So, and the microbial theory of health suggests that there are health appropriate hygiene practices for home and everyday life to reduce those pathogens, but to do that can cause illness, but without discriminating or eliminating the potentially beneficial microbes from the human or from the environmental microbiome. Now, and once again, this is going back to that discussion that we had about tuberculosis. So we are seeing that there is a very, very high rise in antibiotic-resistant pathogens. I think the UK government in this paper, Scott refers to a statement made by the UK government that said they're calling it the post-antibiotic apocalypse that threatens to kill 10 million people globally by 2050 if we do not address these highly antibiotic-resistant pathogens. And this has only come about because there has been such a focus on the germ theory of health, germ theory of disease, rather than focusing on the microbe theory of health. So another article in the British Medical Journal saw, and this is very interesting, but I feel that proper hygiene does have a very important role, but this article in the BMJ said there was an increase. They've noticed and reported a statistical increase in asthma and childhood eczema, and also associated with declining family size and higher standards of personal hygiene practice. Very, very interesting, because they're saying that some of these practices may have led to a reduced exposure to some viruses, which will probably reduce natural immunity. Now, this dysbiosis, that researchers are now understanding the relationship with the gut microbiome and its implication with all these diseases, whether it's cardiovascular disease, obesity, diabetes, depression, Parkinson's disease, autism, and various gastrointestinal cancers. Now, they also report that these gastric and esophageal cancers continue to be two of the most highly common cancers, and it's probably all linked to this dysregulation between the microbe and the microbe host interaction. So the same paper then goes on to say, maybe the microbiota can be compared with Béchamp's theory of microzonia. So my point is that I am hoping that we will see in the coming years Béchamp rewritten back into the history books, and acknowledging him for this incredible work that he has done. Béchamp believed that the disruption of the host microzyma was the predisposition to disease. And this is what we are now seeing with the microbiome. A disruption to the host microbiota is the predisposition to disease. So while Béchamp's theory was ignored by the scientific community then, it is now many researchers are starting to see these conceptual similarities between what we now call the microbiota. Now, it's very interesting, and I hope there's no one suffering from long COVID, but researchers have suggested that the gut microbiome may influence the immune system response to the COVID infection and may also play a role in the severity and the outcome of the infection. And I'll quote here, in light of the reports that there are subsets of recovered patients with COVID who experience persistent symptoms such as fatigue, dyspnea, joint pain, some 80 days after the initial onset of symptoms, they suggest that dysbiotic gut microbiome are possibly contributing to these ongoing health problems post-COVID-19. So we need to find a way to address this. And we're going to look more at this in part 2. It was concluded in this same paper, that supporting and bolstering the beneficial gut species depleted by COVID-19 could serve as a novel avenue to mitigate severe disease. By managing the patient's gut microbiota will reduce some of these long-term symptoms that I felt. Sorry for my typo there, COVID-10. Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. It gets interesting because I think this is a field where there needs to be a lot more research. And I'll be honest, there was very little research available linking and drawing associations between the essential oils and the microbiome. Now, research has recently indicated that certain essential oils may be beneficial for the gut microbiome. Now, and so this is quite interesting. So, and once again, in the blog, I refer a lot more to this study. But what is very interesting now, a lot of the studies are in vitro and a lot of the studies involve animals. Now, the reason a lot of these studies are done on animals, and a lot of these studies are done on animal and adding essential oils to the feed, because in the more corporate approach especially in livestock, they have been traditionally using antibiotics to speed up the growth of pigs, of chicken, and so on, and cows. Now, this is why you're seeing that they're trying to eliminate, because they know by putting, not only are they, doctors prescribing antibiotics, which are creating these antibiotic resistant pathogens, they're putting antibiotics in the food. Now, of course, researchers are trying to say, can we possibly use essential oils and essential oil constituents in the feedstock? And what impact does that have? So far, the results seem quite promising. So I want to be very careful not to extrapolate between these studies done on animals and humans, but of course, it's not hard to see that there will be some association. Now, some of the essential oils that have been studied, for example, include clove oil and two essential oil compounds like thymal and eugenol, essential oils that we know have some potent antimicrobial activity. Now, thymal on its own was found to be highly toxic on all tested strains, even at low dose. That means it killed the good pathogens and the supposedly bad pathogens. Now, clove oil was less effective than thymal at the same given concentration, but it also inhibited both pathogens and commensals as well, so the good pathogens as well. However, eugenol, now this is where it gets interesting, and so more studies need to be done. One of the eugenol, as we know, is the major constituent in clove, displayed similar effects to clove towards the pathogens, but it did not affect the good bacteria as severely. Interesting. So once again, this is very early days in terms of some of the studies that are being done on essential oils and their impact on the microbiota. So, and as I've said, most of these studies are being done on animals, and it's being done, they're using these essential oils to add to the animal feed in the hope that they can reduce the use of antibiotics. Now, here in Queensland, here in Australia, a study is being conducted as we speak to see how essential oils may improve the gut microbiome of chickens. Once again, adding it to the chicken feed. Now, the research that is happening at the University of Queensland involves trialing Australian native essential oils, which all have, you can see by the oils chosen, have relatively good antimicrobial activity, such as tea tree, lemon myrtle, nerulina, nioli, aniseed myrtle, eucalyptus, and Tasmanian pepper. They're doing this study. So it'd be interesting to see the results of this study. This only was out on a blog that came out from the UQ News in May this year. Now, this is where it gets very interesting as well. This was found in a cosmetics journal, and the paper suggests that there is a very strong link between the skin microbiome and the relationship between the internal microbiome and the internal organs, and hence what we refer to as the skin. This author's added the skin gut brain axis. Very interesting. So it is very likely that topical applications of some botanicals may influence this connection between the skin microbiome and the gut microbiome. Now, it was reported that the studies have shown that the skin microbiota also supports and modulates the innate immune system responses. And so it helps in the prevention and of the colonization of potentially pathogenic microorganisms. Now, what the researchers are hoping to understand in this particular study was looking at that relationship of understanding the microbiota's role in helping with wound healing and specific skin diseases such as psoriasis, dermatitis, acne, and chronic skin ulcers. So the microbiome might be involved in speeding up the healing of some of these conditions. And I believe that essential oils may play a very important role when we use them topically in even low percentages. But this is where more studies have to be done. But this particular paper, Zewin, talks about the microdynamics of human epidermis following skin barrier disruption, actually suggests that it's not the microbiome on the superficial skin layer, but the microbiome in the deeper layers of the stratum corneum that help to colonize the damaged superficial skin layer. And they play a more important role in the healing process. So here, the researchers wanted to understand what helped to facilitate the wound healing process and what helps to facilitate an anti-inflammatory response. And they're saying that the microbiome that are found in the deeper layers of the stratum corneum might be involved. Interesting. So, and just in finishing off, we know that what Berry, for example, suggests is that the microbiome of the gut and the skin both have a very strong connection with the immune system and modulating the immune system. Now, whether it is a skin or gut inflammatory condition, they're all interconnected, and it is going to. So maintaining the integrity, the barrier functions of the skin is going to be just as important in maintaining a healthy immune system response, and saying if there is a microbiome dysbiosis, an imbalance of the microbiome in both the skin and the gut, it will lead to potential immune dysfunction, which can potentially lead to disease. So it's very important to consider what we apply topically. It's just fascinating work, isn't it? Look, I hope by the end of this presentation, what I've done is to say both Pasteur and Béchamp had something very important to offer us. By going totally, we created this big imbalance by just following Pasteur's work and not understanding. He was a person ahead of his time. And by not understanding Béchamp's work, we've probably created too much imbalance by going down the path of the germ theory. It's now time that we see a balance. The same way when we talk about a balance between energy, yin and yang energy, I think we will see some big improvements within healthcare as we come to understand the important role of the microbiome. And at least one thing that I got out of this research that I did in presenting this is I now understand what Béchamp was talking about when he was talking about the microzyma. He was talking about these, what we first thought were nanobacteria, which we now know are nanoparticles. And they may still be implicated in the disease state. More research has to be done. Watch this space. Look, I do hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I do look forward to seeing you in July when we will talk about proven strategies to boost the immune system. Thank you very much and have a great evening or a great day wherever you are. Take care. Thank you.